thrilled today to have Dr. Kathryn Sikkink, who is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Kathryn, you have a book that's about to come out this fall in August called Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century. Let's start with the basics, because a lot of people claim a lot of things about human rights, and I'm a little suspicious. What are human rights? Is food a human right? You gotta have food, right?
So I use as my guide of what are human rights the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed in 1948. It was negotiated by all the countries that were members of the UN at the time. And so it's a fully negotiated international multicultural Declaration of Rights. And yes, the right to food is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So you can guarantee somebody's right to food, but you can't argue with nature, right? How do you guarantee against famine or against droughts and things like that?
It's a perfect question, because the notion of a right to food is the belief that you have an entitlement to food. And so Amartya Sen, as you know, who's written about famine, has said famine is not a problem of nature. In fact, it's not a problem of weather or a problem of not enough food. It's the problem of getting the existing food to the people who are starving. And the problem with getting food to people who are starving, it has to do with, can the needs of those people, do they feel entitled to food, and can they make their entitlement known? Okay? So Sen has said, for example, that there is not famine in democracy, because in democracies you have free press, and people are starving, we learn about it, and governments who don't deal with it get elected out of office.
Who decided what are human rights and what are not human rights?
So it was a 2-year process where all the countries that were members of the UN at the time, over 50 countries, 20 of those are from Latin America, by the way, so it was not just the countries of what we now call the global north, right? Negotiated article by article, word by word, exactly what would go in to the Universal Declaration. So it reflected the traditions of many different countries, including China. China was very involved at the time.
This was in the 40s?
1946 and 1948.
And certainly, I mean, so last year I read that in 2016 the UN declared that the internet, the right to internet, is a human right. Now, so does that mean if a parent shuts down their kid's Snapchat, that they're denying their kid a human right and they should be prosecuted?
The fascinating thing about human rights is that human rights contain the seeds for their own expansion. Okay, so originally, before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, people talked about rights. We had the French Declaration of Rights of Man, and they meant only men. Okay, only men had rights. But women used the rights language to demand rights for themselves. Originally, as we know, slaves didn't have rights. Slaves used human rights language to end slavery. And so human rights has been an expanding field. Now, the Universal Declaration says we have a right to information. We have a right to receive and exchange information. Internet didn't exist. It didn't say you have the right to the internet, but it's to say that nowadays, people to be able to receive and exchange information, you almost have to be on the internet.
The title of your book is Evidence for Hope.
Yes.
Making human rights work in the 21st century. So why don't we move to that first? And I've got 2 problems with that. I got a problem with the subtitle first. You said evidence for hope, and right now we're saying, well, look at the world today. We shouldn't be concerned. Nobody wants to take those Syrian refugees. The Arab Spring has turned out to be a spectacular failure for human rights, and there are all these other things that we're witnessing. Of course, the W. Bush era torture policies, institutionalized, denial of human rights. How do you possibly have hope?
Well, I mean, obviously I did this title very consciously.
Because you knew it would get me riled up.
I knew it would get you riled up, and I thought it was important to get people like you and others riled up. Why? Because as worried as we are, and as worried as we need to be right now, we can't forget that there have been amazing transformations in human rights in my lifetime, even in your lifetime, okay? And that is, we forget advances that have been made on women's rights. We forget advances that have been made on racial equality, not just in this country, but around the world. We forget recognition of new rights, the rights of people with disabilities, LGBT communities. Okay, I can tell you some stories. My mother wanted to have a profession. She was told she could be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary. Okay, so she was interested in science. She chose to be a nurse. She told her daughters that we could be whatever we wanted to be. But when I went to Columbia University to begin graduate school in 1981, there were no women teaching in the Columbia University Political Science Department. No women tenure track or tenured faculty. So I didn't even know back in 81, starting a PhD program, if I could even be a professor, if I could ever get tenured. I certainly never thought that I could be a professor at Harvard University. Now, it's not just my story, Women all over the world, and I have data to support it in my book, have made tremendous educational advances in every region of the world. So if you look at a Gini coefficient, which is a coefficient of inequality.
Gini coefficient.
Gini coefficient. We can use it not just for income inequality, we can use it for educational inequality. And compare women's education to men's education. Inequality in gender inequality in education has declined in all areas dramatically in terms of literacy, primary, secondary, and tertiary education. All over the world, more women study at universities and, in fact, teach in universities.
But certainly, so there are a bunch of human rights lawyers out there. There's some naysayers who say, well, maybe there might be some, we made some gains in some areas, but actually, if you look at the expansion of human rights law, you've got more violations of human rights law over the past century. And what that means to me is that, okay, if you have more laws, you'll find more violations. So the solution is to care less, have fewer laws, you'll find fewer violations. The problem is solved.
But you're getting ahead of me, right? Because you're taking one of the main arguments in my book is that one reason we are pessimistic is exactly not because there's more human rights violations than before, but because we know more and we care more about human rights than ever before. The dilemma with measuring progress is that we keep increasing our understanding of what constitutes a human right. So yes, in practice, we have more violations today because we have an expanded sense of rights. But we should be really careful. That doesn't mean there's more suffering today than any time in human history.
How do you know it's declining then?
So I have, in this book, I do a survey of all the best data at my disposal to talk about as many rights as I can. Okay, and I start with the number of wars, number of people killed in wars, genocide and politicide, the use of the death penalty. Then I look at social and economic rights. I look at, as I said, famine. I look at malnutrition. I look at infant mortality. I look at child mortality. I look at life expectancy. And in all of those areas, really in all of those areas, not just improvements, very significant improvements, and across the bar in terms of, if you look at the infant mortality figures, the number of children who die in their first year for every 100,000, you see, all the countries of the world, dramatic decline like this. That doesn't mean that things are great in Africa, for example. There still are high levels of mortality in many countries of Africa. But if you compare it to even 20 years ago, the improvements are really very significant.
Do we want human rights to work in the 21st century? How are we supposed to get good trade deals with China and Russia if we're pestering them about these human rights problems? Shouldn't we care about U.S. being number one? Is that the most important thing? How does human rights help us there?
So Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, we know, has
man.
recently said that we should only care about national security and U.S. economic interests, and we should stop talking about human rights and our values.
It's not as important.
So it's like Tillerson has not read like 2 decades of social science research. Okay, so national security, the biggest issue is war. The single most important finding, as you know very well as a security scholar of international relations, the single most important finding is the democratic peace hypothesis. And what that says is that democracies don't go to war with other democracies, right? And it's been supported by really strong data of actually centuries of data, okay? So promoting democracy is not just like our values that hurts our interests. If our interest is to reduce war in the world, to reduce countries that will attack others, one of the best things we can do is to promote democracy, because those democracies historically, simply have not gone to war with other democracies.
Okay, so the right to democracy, but what about, say, women's right to contraception or other sorts of things that are a little more socially controversial?
Okay, so, women's rights, we are very worried about insurgencies. We're very worried about violent men in the world, right? And that's actually connected to issues of population. And we know that one of the best ways that you can promote health and well-being of families is to give women some control over their choices of family size, okay? And the countries in the world that are the most violent today are countries that have high population growth, where women do not have control over their size of their families and cannot provide always the best education and health to their children. So I just feel like more and more research is showing that our values for human rights and democracy and our interests very much coincide. And it's such a short-sighted notion what Tillerson's saying. So what? So we have Donald Trump embracing the dictators of, well, actually in this case, the elected dictator of the Philippines or of Egypt, who were some of the people first invited to the White House. These are people who are in control of governments that are killing actually thousands of their citizens. In Cairo, in one day, almost 1,000 people were killed in a number of squares. So how do they really think that's going to create stable, peaceful countries, that those are the kind of allies that are going to help us advance our interests in the world?
Are we sure that Donald Trump doesn't care about human rights? Because he says he does, so he must, right? I mean, he struck Syria with the nothing speaks louder than an airstrike. He said he bombed Syria because of those innocent little babies that were being killed.
Yeah. Another argument I make in this book is that we really overestimate the degree to which we should use military means to promote human rights. It's very questionable whether you can bomb people in a democracy or you can bomb people to protect human rights. And so I advocate, based on my best survey of history, mainly nonviolent means to promoting human rights. So no, I don't actually.
You don't think Donald Trump is true to his word?
That's not the way I think his concern for human rights is best expressed or promoted.
What are other things that concern you about the current political environment?
One of the biggest concerns is that we have a series of what our colleague Steve Levitsky calls electoral authoritarianism, right? We have these governments like Duterte's in the Philippines that are elected, but then they use their election to carry out increasingly authoritarian policies. And so the problem there is they have legitimacy of elections, right? But they use that legitimacy, they use the rules of democracy to undermine human rights and democracy. Venezuela would be another good example, right? And so those are kind of hard cases because they have more legitimacy than your kind of garden variety authoritarians, but they've been very clever at using the rules of democracy to undermine human rights.
Garden variety authoritarian sounds like a really good band name. But anyway, so what does the United States do? Does the United States sign on to more treaties? This is the United States, right? It's not a party to the ICC, for instance. It's not. It's got other sorts of human rights treaties it has not signed on to. Does the United States, you said, so if we can't bomb them into accepting human rights treaties, do we send more people? Does diplomacy work here?
Ultimately, both democracy and human rights are mainly secured through struggle. Okay, governments do not hand democracy and human rights to their citizens on a platter. People struggle for them, and mainly people within a country have to struggle for human rights and democracy in their country. Okay, so we should be cautious about how much we think foreign countries can deliver human rights through our foreign policy, okay? But we can do things to not make it worse, right? And so, for example, after the coup in Egypt, the Obama administration did not receive the Egyptian leaders who were repressing their citizens. They didn't embrace them. right? And so symbolically that was important. We were at least communicating to the Egyptian people that
We're with you. Yeah.
that we weren't going to, embrace this repressive government. So when Donald Trump invites Sisi to the White House, embraces him and says he's a good guy, then we're using the power of our diplomacy, I think, in very negative ways.
And you're also saying that that's undermining our national security.
I believe it's undermining our national security interests, yes. So ratifying human rights treaties is a good first start, but it's only a first start. Treaties are just paper. They're tools for mobilization. And so Beth Simmons has showed that international treaties can work. They're correlated with improvements in human rights, but only if people on the ground use treaties to mobilize, to litigate, and to pressure for human rights change. Okay, so the crucial issue is not saying, well, ratify treaty, that'll be enough. Mm-hmm. The crucial issue is supporting nonviolent groups that are working on behalf of human rights, that are mobilizing on behalf of human rights. And we can do that too through our foreign policy, and we have in the past. The U.S. government, through the National Endowment for Democracy and through other programs, has provided financial assistance to human rights organizations, and we should continue to do that.
Kathryn, I'd like to transition to my favorite part of the day,
okay,
which involves food, involves snacks. Your favorite snack is shortbread,
right,
by Walker's. Now, I don't know if anyone else even makes shortbread. I feel like I only see Walker's shortbread.
Other people do, but these are better.
These are better.
Yeah.
Higher butter content.
Higher butter content.
So what is it about shortbread that you like?
I like the butter.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sikkink is a Dutch name. I'm the granddaughter of Dutch farmers. My great-grandparents came from the Netherlands. They were poor farmers from a zone of bad soil. And they came and got land in southern Minnesota and set up a dairy farm, right?
Really?
And so, yeah. And so
shortbread's in your blood.
Yeah, butter's in my blood. And so, my grandmother was a great cook. My mom was a great cook, too.
So it's something you grew up with?
I grew up with, put it this way, I grew up not with Scottish shortbread, I grew up with butter cookies, Dutch butter cookies. Yeah. But this is the closest I can come if I buy it off a shelf.
Do you think that access to shortbread is a human right?
No.
Well, maybe it should be. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.